So good morning, everyone. Welcome to HKU. We're very happy to see you here in our first event for the Department of Psychology. My name is Christian. I'm a tutor in this department. And for our first event, we'll be hosting a mock lecture. So the intention here is to give you guys sort of an experience of what a college lecture is like, and also to inform you about some of the topics covered in our department and our program. Okay, so we're going to start off strong with Professor Benjamin Becker. Professor Becker is a full professor here in the Department of Psychology. His expertise is on researching how the brain processes emotions and motivations, and when these processes are dysfunctional, how they may lead to mental health disorders. So I'm sure you guys will find it very important and interesting. So Professor Becker, I'll pass the time to you.
Okay, thanks very much. It's a pleasure seeing so many people interested in our topic today on psychology. And I will first start with my mock lecture, which will give a general impression about how we teach here the science of emotion. And as Christian already said, the science of emotion is also generally quite interesting or important. And I will also go to this in my lecture because we see it strongly related to mental health. And we see currently mental health problems are very much one of the major difficulties that we face worldwide. I would give a rather general instruction. Then Professor Frances Jin will also give her mock lecture on a related topic, so on the brain basis of anxiety and depression, and I think also on psychopathology. So what goes wrong when these emotions don't work out? And we then will both talk like 20, 25 minutes, particularly also to give you the chance to ask us questions. So after both talks, both of us will stay here. We come to the stage, and if you have questions, you can ask us whatever questions you like. So you can start us about studying psychology, about the brain, but also about our own experience, our own research, whatever you like. So we will stay here and be here for you. All right, Christian already introduced me very briefly, but let me just give you a quick overview about where I come from, why although I found this topic interesting, and how I became basically a bit of a psychology teacher. So basically, I started with psychology in Germany. So I'm German also, and you see here, this is my university in Germany, the University of Trier. And the University of Trier is one of the very scientifically oriented universities in Germany. So although we are mostly focused on natural science and not so much on physiological sciences, at least in the part of psychology. I then went on to make a PhD, so basically to do independent studies for 3 or 4 years. And then after I had this background in general psychology, I focused strongly on clinical psychology, but also on brain imaging. As you see here, I've been working in different universities in Germany, like for instance, Düsseldorf, but also University Clinic of Cologne, where I was able to also work with patients. So basically during this time, I also realized that mental health is a big problem. One key problem that we had in these clinics, and that's not just a clinic for this clinic in Germany, but it's the same for most clinics worldwide. What we had is when patients come in with anxiety, with depression, with addiction, we are somehow able to help them. So we are able to actually help quite a number of patients, but we are not able to help all patients. So if we just then look at the big numbers, we see that round about 1 in 3 patients with anxiety or with depression, they don't, we call it adequately response to treatment. But in the end, that means they don't really become better, no matter which kind of treatment we apply. Or they become better, go home, and we see them back after 2 or 3 months. So there we realized, not just me, but also lots of other people, this is a big problem, and we have to find solutions for this. We then also see more and more that these mental disorders, they are influenced by social factors, by social environment, by genetic factors, but also by really neurobiological factors. So for instance, changes in the brain. So I then moved on to the neuroscience centers here in Bonn. It's another city in Germany with a very nice castle, actually. It was the previous capital before it went back to Berlin. And there I focused on studies to try to understand the brain. And we could show there that lots of the mental disorders like depression, like anxiety, like addiction are actually characterized by specific changes in the brain. And the interesting part was also, if then the patients become better with good treatment, their brain becomes normal again. So we somehow could show, not just from our research, but from lots of other researchers, that the brain somehow plays an important role. If people have have a mental disorder, but although it becomes normal again, which actually is good news, because this shows us we then have a target that we can target. So we can do cognitive behavioral therapy, but although we can use brain training to help people with mental disorders. I then went for a couple of years to China, for instance, to Chengdu at the UESDC, where I was in the Department of Life Science, where we although stronger work with technological aspects, for instance, with machine learning and with brain imaging, to find out how can we train the brain and make the brain normal again. Finally, I now not ended up here, but finally came to Hong Kong. So I'm now working at the University of Hong Kong, where we try to bring all of this together, although under the umbrella of psychology. What we are doing is, I've already told you a bit, and this also Christian told you, we're trying to find out how humans process emotions, how they process emotions and motivation. The second thing, we are looking at patients with mental disorders to find out what goes wrong in emotions, in motivation in these patients, and with the ultimate aim to come up with better and new treatments for these disorders. Because as we will also see, it's quite a huge problem, and the numbers are pretty high for people suffering from anxiety and suffering from depression. We are doing this with a very technical approach. So we are bringing together psychological experiments, psychological theories, which are very important for our research. But because we are trying to find out the biological basis, we are basically using quite a lot of heavy technology. So as you see here, this is, for instance, my team doing fMRI studies. That is, we put participants, patients, healthy subjects in an MRI scanner, and then ask them to do a specific task. For instance, we induce fear, or we ask them to make a memory task. And with this, we can measure the specific brain regions that are involved. However, we are not just trying to find out what is basically going not well in the brain, but we are trying to find new treatments for this. And one thing we recently developed is basically a brain training that works relatively well, I could say. So what we do is participants basically wear a cap. It's called an FNIRS cap. It measures brain activity online. And then participants can play something like a computer game. And in this computer game, they see their own brain activity. And roundabout, most participants can learn in 30 to 60 minutes to control their brain. So it's something kind of a brain training. We are now moving on to see if this can also help in young people with mental disorders. So as we've seen, we are trying to bring all of this together under the umbrella of psychology and mental health. And this is also the topic of my lecture that I usually talk about. This is the science of emotion. So it not just covers the brain aspects, but it's much broader, because we see, to understand emotions, to understand motivation, we can't just focus on one thing. So if I now say I'm a brain researcher, I want to focus just on the brain, you will all say this is a view too narrow. Because for emotions, we know lots of things play a role, like social environment, how we interact with other people. And this is something where psychology, for instance, is very strong on, and also particularly social psychology. Another thing is we have to understand, how do we compute, for instance, when we interact with other people? How do we compute our emotions? This is a part of cognitive science. We then, this aspect that I've shown, are very biological. This is part of neuroscience and biology. And although the field has benefited quite a lot from technical developments, this is brain imaging on the one hand side, but we also use more and more machine learning or artificial intelligence applications to understand how humans behave and how their brain behaves. So you see all of this together. If we want to understand the science of emotions, we have to broaden our horizon. So we can't just say, it's just psychology. We can't say, it's just biology. We can't say it's just social environment. So we have to have a very complex picture and to try how humans process emotions and also how this plays along with mental disorders. We there see that this field of trying to understand how people feel their emotions is relatively young. We just look at one of the, well, not the founding fathers, some of the first people who were interested in this and who established this field. This is Jaak Panksepp, and unfortunately, he passed away, I think, like 2 years ago. But he was one of the first people who brought all of this together as a real science. And he only coined the term, like the science of emotion or the affective neuroscience, in the 1990s. And this is, if you see like this is just like 30 years ago, maybe. On the other hand, if we see lots of other fields, they are much older. If we look at medicine, medicine is maybe real experimental medicine is like 800, maybe 1,000 years already old, or it goes maybe back to the old Greece already. If we look at other fields, even psychology is like 100, 200 years old. So we see it's a very young field, but this makes it also very exciting. So we are basically making progress nearly every day if we look at current research papers to understand how the human brain, how humans process emotions, and how this plays in also in mental disorders. The key question is now when I say, well, we are just at the beginning, we don't understand this very good, so we are still trying to find out how the brain processes emotions. The key factor is we can just look in the future. Let's now just imagine we are 200 years in advance, we have super good brain imaging, we have super good psychological theories, and we have solved all of these problems to understand how humans process emotions and emotions. What could we gain with this? Is it just interesting for us in psychology when I sit here in my office and I read my papers? Be super interesting. But in the end, if we try to solve these problems, it can have lots of implications for daily life and for lots of aspects that are actually important, not just for me as a researcher, but also for clinicians working with patients, but for lots of aspects in our daily life. Let's just consider we are living 200, 300 years in the future and we have solved most of these problems. Let's see what problems could we then address. Some of these problems could be, which I already said, mental disorders. Because round about 10 years ago, or maybe meanwhile 20 years ago, the World Health Organization made one discovery that really changed lots of the research. So during this time, they made huge questionnaire studies. So all around the world, in nearly every country in the world, ranging from Hong Kong, China, to my home country, Germany, and to the US, to try to find out what are the key problems for health that humans have right now. So, and they call it then, this is a burden of disease. Burden of disease is a very technical term, but it basically means this is the most pressing health issues, which have the most negative effects on human suffering, on the economy, and also on the society as a whole. And a bit surprising at this time, they found actually that here, mental disorders are the top reason of suffering worldwide. Everyone had somehow expected the typical disorders. Everyone was expecting it's probably cancer, it's probably cardiovascular disorders, maybe stroke, disorders that lots of people know that we see in everyday life. However, it actually turned out, if you crunch the numbers, mental disorders are the key reason of suffering worldwide. And the numbers are quite high. There are different numbers that we can crunch, but a good rule of thumb is that probably 1 in 5 individuals in their lives will suffer from a mental disorders. And this is, if you just look at maybe here are, I don't know, 60 people, something like that. If you imagine in every row sitting of the people here, one person in there will have a mental disorder at one time point in their lives. And this is not feeling a bit sad or feeling a bit fearful. This means really a diagnosed mental disorder which needs treatment. And if we then switch further and just look at what are the most common mental disorders that we have, it's actually mostly anxiety, depression. Then we see addiction like drug use disorders. If we just look at these two major disorders, anxiety and depression, what do they have in common? Or why do these people go over to a medical doctor, go to a psychiatrist and look for treatment? The major reason is suffering, emotional problems. So all of these patients, one of their key problems is they feel very negative. They either have very strong anxiety, a very strong fear, and not just one afternoon, but every day in their life for months or for weeks. And the same holds true for depression. This is a very strong negative emotional state. People feel very, very bad and very hopeless. So we see that these dysregulations in emotions are a key factor contributing to suffering worldwide. And I'm pretty sure that Professor Francis Jin will also talk about this in a later stage. So if we now can find out which brain regions are involved or what is the underlying biological basis of these disorders, this is a study that has been done by one of my PhD students. It's a meta-analysis where she had data from thousands of patients worldwide, put this together, and then could show that, for instance, in patients with depression, we see that 2 or 3 brain regions are basically affected. These brain regions are working different than in healthy participants. If we now know which specific brain region is involved, so for instance, this part of the brain, we can then come up with new treatments. So we can think about how can we try to make this part of the brain normal again in these patients. And we have seen over the last couple of 10 years that there are novel treatments where we can modulate the brain. For instance, like this is TMS. This is basically new technology that uses magnetic fields and can stimulate specific parts of the brain. So to make them more active or to maybe decrease activity. So with this, we can now, if we know which region is not really functioning in depression, we can somehow try to help the patients with depression. And this technology has been recently been approved by the FDA, so in the US, but also by the CFDA in mainland China as a new treatment for depression. So this is quite a big breakthrough. So basically, scientists have found out what is the brain region, why people with depression feel bad. And now we can come up with a new technology that can target this brain region and then is now used to treat patients. And this is a nice translation from basically from research into a real application. Another application could be new developments, like for instance, AI. We have more and more AI-based agents like these guys here that are used in care, for instance, in elderly home care, where we see that we have a lack of people, of caretakers. What we more and more see, or what could be a solution, could be AI-inspired social robots that interact with elder people or also with patients to help them. And there, it would obviously be very, very advantageous if these entities can read emotions. So basically can see if the person that they are interacting with, if this person is under stress, or also can interactively organize with this. Another application could be we can measure stress. We can measure if someone is tired. We can measure if someone is attentive based on their brain activity. There are now initial companies that are using this basically to observe if pilots, if people in very stressful jobs, if they are really still attentive, or if they are, for instance, stressed, if they are tired. So with this, we can also increase, for instance, safety in everyday life. Another application, and this is more on the societal level, if we understand emotions, is crime. Because in everyday life, if you go to the cinema, if you there watch something about crime, it's usually someone, a mastermind who hacks a bank or something like that. And it's a very cognitive mastermind. He really understands the system and then makes a big heist. However, in everyday life, most part of criminal activities that you see in front of a judge are emotional crimes. So lots of things that you see is not the mastermind who tries to hack the supercomputer. Most part that you see in everyday life are things like that: reckless driving, people getting into fights, yelling out of the car. And this is not a very cognitive genius crime, but it's actually a very strong emotional crime. So these people are very angry and get into fights with each other. Another thing what we see is hate crimes. Hate crimes are crimes that are conducted because someone has a different race, someone looks different, someone has a different religion. And if we there just look at the numbers, it's a huge problem. If you look, this is the statistics from the US, so I didn't find statistics for Hong Kong and also not for Germany, for instance. But this is a very good and very solid statistic from the US. And if we just look at the US alone, they have over 10,000 hate crimes per year. That is a dozen every day. And if you look at this, why do people commit these hate crimes? Because people look different. They have a different race, they have a different ethnicity, different ancestry, they have a different gender identity or different religion. And if you look at these crimes, these are not cognitive crimes from mastermind. These are emotionally driven crimes. So people just get very angry with other people and because they are from a different race. And if we can understand this, we can try to solve all of these problems. So we can see, why do people get so angry? Why do they get so violent with other people just because they're from a different race. This is one other thing. A third thing that we can, or fourth thing that we can solve is trying to also improve adolescent mental health. And one key problem that we currently see in adolescent mental health is that, and lots of people are concerned about it, is what do mobile phones, what does those social media to our emotions? We have seen some initial evidence that maybe social media is not good for adolescent mental health. But for instance, we are currently lacking very good data. So the question is, does it have good or negative effects? We currently don't know. We just have initial data that says that people spend a huge amount of time on social media. So we see here average time spent on social media, mostly on the mobile phone. It's over 2 hours, and it's different. It differs by country, it differs by region. So it's most common in Asia and in North America, and mostly in young people. And we currently don't know what does this do to the brain and to the emotional processes in the younger generation. So what we there need is all those and solid research that can show us and also can inform policies, for instance, to have age restrictions for social media. But right now, we don't have data on this. Initial data that we see shows that excessive social media use somehow leads to decreased life satisfaction, leads to increased depression, leads to increased anxiety, leads to increases in eating disorder and lower self-esteem. However, this is just very initial data, and we currently don't know. So if we understand how the brain processes emotion, we can also understand which kind of negative impact does it have. Does it have a negative impact, and do we need to protect specific people? Finally, we can come to the question, what are emotions actually? And if we look into the books, like into the psychology books, for instance, we see often very abstract. If we think about emotions, we all have a very clear picture of this. What is an emotion? Think I feel sad, I feel happy. However, if we look in the psychology books, we often see very abstract descriptions. We see what are emotions? Emotions are complex, multidimensional process in response to internal, external events. Have you thought about this before? It sounds super technical, no? Another thing that we see is emotions include subjective experience. That's what we are usually thinking about if we're thinking about an emotion. Then physiological changes, like changes in heart rate. So we start sweating, our heart starts pounding. We see brain changes, and we see behavioral expression, which often you see in the face. So if we're happy, show a specific face expression. If we are fearful, we also show a specific face. Sounds very technical, but the key point is what we see here is emotions are not just what we feel, the subjective experience, but it's also the entire bodily response. Sounds very technical, so now let's just look at an example. Imagine you go hiking here in Hong Kong, and you're somehow in I don't know, where you like to go hiking on one of these islands. Suddenly you encounter a snake, and just think about this, what happens? One thing is obviously we feel very fearful. This is a strongly aversive emotional state. The second thing is although we feel accelerated breathing and increased heart rate. So basically the body gets prepared for something that we call the fight or flight response. So basically running away or fighting. The third part that we have is we see specific changes in the brain. There we have seen over the last 20 years that some brain regions like the amygdala, this little part in the brain, are very active when we feel fear. The final part is we show a specific face or body expression. And all of this together, so these 4 levels, is what we scientifically describe as an emotion. So it's not just how I feel, but it's basically the entire preparation of the body to allow us to encounter something like a threat. Finally, this is my last slide now. We have seen over the last 30 years an increasing progress into how we can use novel technologies to find out what is the part of the brain in there. How does the brain process with mental disorders? Pretty sure that Professor Francis Jim will talk about this. But just to give you an impression, like this is like maybe one of the first patients with a specific brain disorder, Phineas Gage. You will also find him in all of the psychology books. So what happened to this person basically like nearly 100 years ago, he was working on the railroad construction site in the US. and a metal rod went through his head, so through his mouth and through his head, and damaged this part of the brain, so basically the part that's behind the eyes. And he survived, so it was a bit of a wonder that he actually survived. But what the doctors observed during this time is, after this lesion to his brain, he basically became very impatient. He lost all of his money, so he made bad decisions, and he got often into fights. And this then led to the first discovery that actually the brain is involved in how we regulate our behavior and our emotions. Before, no one had the brain so strongly actually in their minds. We now have, over the last years, transformed this with brain imaging, with AI, with machine learning, with real-time data analysis, and quite fascinating things. And we see more and more that the brain is actually quite important for feeling emotions. I think that's what I wanted to tell you. Hope I could give you a bit of an impression. I would like to give over now to Professor Francis Jin.
Thank you very much, Professor Becker. So if you have any questions, as Professor Becker explained, we'll have a Q&A at the end after the next lecture.